I'm Ana Leon Guerrero, Professor of Sociology at PLU. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement. PLU is a settler institution on the land of the Nisqually, Puyallup, Soxquin Island, and Steilacoom nations. The Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854 forcibly removed these nations from their land to make way for colonial settlement, of which PLU is a part. We acknowledge and respect the stewardship, leadership, and sovereignty of our Indigenous neighbors that continue to this day. It is my pleasure to introduce our opening speakers, Maureen Hetherington, founder and CEO of the Junction Community and Peace Building Center, and Eamonn Baker, the training coordinator for Towards Understanding and Healing, based in Derry, Northern Ireland. Historian James Waller describes Northern Ireland as a wonderful and wounded place. It is a beautiful country with warm and welcoming people, yet it is also deeply wounded, carrying the scars seen and unseen, tangible and intangible, acknowledged and unacknowledged, of the aftermath of 30 years of disfiguring violence in the latter half of the 20th century. Key anniversaries of the 1921 partition, the period known as the Troubles, and the 1998 Good Friday Peace Agreement bring the Northern Irish back to the past, and sadly, these anniversaries are used by politicians and stakeholders as opportunities to divide rather than unite conflicted communities. Against this backdrop, Maureen and Eamonn have developed an authentic, grounded approach that honors the individual experience in the context of the larger story of sectarian conflict in Northern Ireland. As Eamonn explains, it's tricky to be good neighbors with folks divided by walls, by schools, by housing estates. If we don't know our neighbors through daily or weekly contact, sectarianism can find opportunities to have its say, to put down roots, and to flourish. Their methodology incorporates storytelling and positive encounter dialogue, where those traumatized by the conflict can receive acknowledgement of their experiences and begin to understand the experiences of others. Understanding the wider extent of the Troubles allows participants to access each other's history, culture, and politics, to transcend the ideologies and sectarian narratives responsible for their suffering and loss, and discover their shared humanity. They maneuver with compassion, bravery, and skill between and within nationalist and unionist communities, bringing together former British soldiers, ex-security forces personnel, ex-combatants, people injured or bereaved, the carers and families of victims, and community members. They also engage with youth who have no lived experiences of the Troubles. Together, they create safe enough spaces where open-hearted, authentic sharing might happen. They've been engaged in this effort since 1992 and remain committed to leaving a different legacy for future generations. According to Maureen, unless people are given the opportunity to deal with their own hurts, there can be no movement towards individual or community healing and the building of trust and good relations between the communities. In their talk, Testimony, Moving Society Out of the Shadows of the Past, Maureen will trace the development of Towards Understanding and Healing as a response to individual and community trauma, while Eamonn will describe the process of testimony and share evidence of its healing impact. At the end of their talk, we'll have time to respond to questions from audience members. You can use the Q&A feature throughout their presentation. Please join me in welcoming Maureen Hetherington and Eamonn Baker.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you for inviting us to present at the Wang Centre Symposium on Healing, Pathways for Renewal and Restoration. We're disappointed not to be able to join you in person because we've had a very long-standing relationship with Pacific Lutheran University through the years, so we feel very honoured to be a part of this gathering to discuss this very important topic. I'm very conscious of the fact that in preparing for this, we're witnessing the horrendous events as they unfold in Ukraine, hearing the harrowing experiences of people living through it. So I'd like to begin by presenting a brief overview of Northern Ireland and the context in which our project Towards Understanding and Healing was created. The nature and complexity of the Northern Ireland conflict is sometimes difficult to articulate, so please forgive my generalisation at times to get the message across. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we're white and we're Christian in the main. This gives us white privilege. We punch way above our weight on the world stage, receiving attention in the world media that is often denied to many other conflicts across the world. That said, all conflict and violence, no matter where it is played out, has devastating, long-lasting consequences for those who have been directly or indirectly impacted. And as a grassroots-based organisation, we're very cognizant of the suffering. So first of all, I'm screen sharing now, so I'd just like to show you or tell you a little bit about Northern Ireland. It was created in the northeast of Ireland when the island of Ireland was partitioned in 1921, with the 100th anniversary of 2021 being either celebrated or mourned, depending on one's politics and religion. As Fergal Cochrane in his book, Northern Ireland, The Reluctant Peace put it, Northern Ireland was forged out of centuries of division, religious, economic, political, cultural, and physical. So Northern Ireland is a part of the United Kingdom, with the rest of Ireland becoming independent in 1949 when the Republic of Ireland was declared. The majority of the Northern Ireland population in 1921, then and now, are from the Unionist tradition, mainly of the Protestant faith, and who wish to remain in the United Kingdom. The minority were and are from the nationalist tradition, mainly Roman Catholic, and their aspiration is for a united Ireland. So remaining within the United Kingdom or becoming part of a united Ireland is the ongoing constitutional dilemma where a politics of violence continues to raise its ugly head within a society that is deeply divided politically, religiously, and culturally. Leon Uris, who authored the beloved Irish classic Trinity, quite rightly said of Ireland, "There is no future, just history repeating itself." So beginning with the recent troubles in 1969 and ending with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, in a population of 1.8 million, over 3,700 were killed, 68% of them being civilians, over 47,500 injured, and records would indicate approximately 37,000 shootings and over 16,000 bombs planted. Every day of the year marks the anniversary of someone's death as a result of the conflict. And there is a hierarchy of victims which has been created, given our deep divisions and contested history and contested memory. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So key anniversaries from the Troubles drag us back to the past, and politicians use them as weapons to score political points, rather than using them as opportunities for reflection and future visioning of a society that might instead be about compassion, inclusivity, and healing. Instead, politics is toxic and damaging, focusing on power and self-interest. So there are huge issues of identity and belonging, especially in the wake of Britain leaving the European Union, Brexit as it has now become known. Politicians agitate for a new referendum on the border, reawaken issues around partition, and the constitutional question. Unfortunately, the media fuel and feed the beast. And this is our legacy. So I hope this offers just a brief, if somewhat simplistic insight into the nature and complexity of the Northern Ireland problem and why moving society out of the shadows of the past is a generational challenge with, at its heart, the need for individual and societal healing. Healing of individuals and healing of communities is crucial in any post-conflict, post-violence society, to begin a healing and reintegration of those impacted directly and indirectly by the conflict. Such individuals and communities can be, and often are, the symbols and agents of hope and change in the future, and Eamonn will talk more on this. So towards understanding and healing, it's a project set up to deal with the hurts of the past through storytelling and dialogue. The project seeks to address the suffering and the bereavement of individuals and communities arising from our recent violent conflict. Specifically, we help to create a safe space for people to begin to tell their personal stories and also to listen to the stories or truths of others. Because of Northern Ireland's diverse history and culture, no one person can tell the story of the past 30 years. our project emphasises the need to bring together all of the disparate narratives that comprise the story of Northern Ireland in order to better understand the legacy of the past and the potential for the future. Over the years, Towards Understanding and Healing has developed a two-pronged approach to facilitating important encounters. Storytelling allows participants to tell and hear personal stories in a fully supportive atmosphere. Positive encounter dialogue provides participants with the opportunity to have more challenging exchanges relating to critical issues pertaining to the conflict. Two of the distinguishing factors of Towards Understanding and Healing's work are that it involves highly diverse groups, such as victims of state and paramilitary violence, former combatants of all stripes, such as police, army, paramilitaries, and people from outside of Northern Ireland who have been impacted by the conflict and violence, such as Great Britain and the Republic of Ireland. There are a number of very important steps factored into the process, including safety, which is a key aspect of every encounter facilitated by the organisation. Inclusivity. Societal healing needs an approach that incorporates all the hurts and truths, no matter how difficult or contentious they may be. Ethical considerations are factored into every process so that participants retain complete control of their story and experiences, and that we do no harm. So within such a process, we need to also recognise that grieving is a critical and crucial part of the healing process for lives lost, and how memorialisation and commemorative practice is a core tenet of grieving. In Northern Ireland, we have two dominant identities and cultures that present the potential for a clash of cultural expression through the mechanisms of memorialisation and commemoration. In commemorating, we enter into politics of public grieving, involving a public debate or determination about appropriate and inappropriate forms of grieving, appropriate and inappropriate times for grief, and appropriate and inappropriate lives to grieve for. So within this power dynamic, some lives are privileged. So what causes us to overlook other people's pain, and can this be challenged? So in Northern Ireland, we wrestle with contentious commemorations that may and do act as barriers to individual and community healing. We have what we call victims and the state of exception. Since the birth of Northern Ireland, since the birth of city and then nation states, those pursuing domination and conquest, as well as those resisting and seeking liberation from same, have invoked what has come to be known as the state of exception. Both the security forces of governments and paramilitaries opposing them have invariably claimed the right to suspend the normal rule of law and order, as the case may be, to defend the status quo or to overthrow it. The right to life itself is suspended. Draconian measures are introduced. In declaring the situation exceptional, justification is provided to protagonists to act essentially as they please in pursuit of their objectives, such as the story of wars and conflict throughout history. So in Northern Ireland, the security forces of government operated during the Troubles under state of exception measures, and their legacy remains. The Northern Ireland Emergency Provisions Acts of 1973 and 1975 was extended through the Prevention of Terrorism Act in 2005. They allow the law to continue to be suspended indefinitely. During the Troubles, Republican and Loyalist paramilitaries proclaimed and maintained a state of exception, often using the term collateral damage to justify acts of violence as a means to an end and as a response to the other's violence. Paramilitaries and their supporters are still deeply invested in maintaining the legitimating frameworks of the state of exception to maintain a moral high ground and victimhood. So all of this creates enormous difficulties for those attempting to deal with the painful past, and an essential aspect of which is the need to get to the truth of what happened. Access to official archives is invariably blocked by the authorities, citing national security considerations as the reason. And with such official silence prevailing, paramilitaries are under no obligation to act otherwise. So in the wake of conflict, the definition of victim becomes hotly contested. It is argued, for example, that persons who have blood on their hands ought not to be called victims, that they have no place alongside our victims who are only operating in self-defense. So there's a constant effort to engage in a classification of victims, to insist that there are innocent victims and there are those who are not, that some victims are more victim than others. So much of this reflects our society's embedded patriarchy, sectarianism, racism, religious upbringing, morals and values. In a society transitioning out of violence, it is much more difficult to establish categories such as guilt and innocence than in a just and ordered society. So we need therefore to be able to maintain a critical space between the victim, the one who has suffered, the witness and the evidence that is presented, performance, what has happened, and the audience, the observers, that can facilitate an ongoing dialogue about the memory of traumatic pasts. We also need empathy that forces us to pause before we continue to reproduce our own assumptions. These are the types of considerations we are mindful of in our encounters, and we have developed training resources and materials to deliver training to encourage a wider societal engagement around these issues. So while storytelling and dialogue are universal practices, the model towards understanding and healing is designed for the context of Northern Ireland. It is totally inclusive and allows a safe space for people to hear perspectives that would otherwise not be possible. Influenced by international models of practice, the model has been designed to provide people who have experienced the trauma of conflict to receive acknowledgement of their experiences and to begin to understand the experiences of the other. The storytelling and dialogue process works at achieving a shared post-conflict society, person by person, by allowing people to understand each other's history, culture, politics, and humanity. These are delicate processes requiring much care and preparation. It has proven to be an extremely effective process, allowing people to access each other in a deep-reaching manner that is not usual in our society. The impact on individuals can be both immediate and long-ranging, achieving a degree of healing and comfort, as well as openness to other people and cultures. The potential for storytelling and dialogue's impact on society is immense. Once people have rehumanized each other after long-term protracted conflict, it is more difficult to return to violence in the future and much easier to work towards a shared society. The project has found storytelling and positive encounter dialogue to be a powerful tool in allowing people from various communities throughout Northern Ireland to hear and understand each other's perspective regarding the past and how best to address the hurts and legacy of the past in order to create a shared future. To date, the project has shared stories through personal encounter, recorded and documented stories through drama, and the production of DVDs. Operating since 2000, we have covered all of Northern Ireland and the border counties, and with newly trained trainers, we have reached thousands of people at different levels. We have now moved to another stage. In the absence of any political agreement on how to deal with the past, and while recognising the legal and judicial dimensions of the overall task, there has been an imperative on the community and voluntary sector to create spaces for truth recovery, based on a restorative justice model, to enable people to have their lived experience acknowledged publicly. This stage offers a public arena for individuals to give testimony, which is carried out in a very controlled and supportive environment. The format is semi-formal in nature and makes use of ritual to both respect and honour all those participating and those they may be remembering. So, the South African model acknowledged diverse truths that go beyond factual or forensic truth And these diverse truths have been employed to give recognition and meaning to the process in the absence of a formal mechanism. And you can see them up in the slideshow, and they can be accessed through the book or booklet, All Truth is Better. So the project is committed to honouring all of these truths, which are very much part of what is needing to be told or recovered and put into the public domain as part of our understanding of and coming to terms with the past and the potential for healing and moving on. But it may be helpful in this regard to distinguish between retributive and restorative justice. The focus of Western society on punitive retributive justice, which veers close to revenge, is far from helpful in the business of moving on from past violence, quite apart from the fact that it doesn't work. So as indicated above, the project seeks to promote the sharing of restorative truths, inviting participants to explore, for example, what truths or resources do we have between us that can enable the damage and pain of the troubles at individual, community, and societal levels to be undone. This is not about replacing the need for justice in a court of law. This is about exploring, in the absence of a truth commission, how we as a society might contribute to restoring hope and honour to those hurt directly and indirectly by the violence of the past. So the heart of testimony is working with integrity and with an emphasis on doing no harm. And here we have an idea of what testimony as a possible restorative justice model, how it sits between towards understanding and healing and legal processes. So while towards understanding and healing is informal, the testimony is in a public forum and it is semi-formal in nature, whereas legal processes would be very formal and legal. It's an individual process with TUH, whereas testimony has the individual, the community, and societal engagement. Then we have the processing, which is very important, whereas the legal processes can be just about justice and possibly punitive justice. And understanding and acknowledgement, traumatizing or triggering trauma may be possible in legal processes. And then the recognition of hurt and potential for healing, the recognition of hurt, wider understanding, family and community, and potential for healing. Recognition of hurt is a question mark under legal processes. There may be further hurt depending on the outcomes, which are always unknown. So that's just a little flavour of what we offer under Towards Understanding and Healing. And now I'm going to hand you over to Eamonn, who will give a more detailed outline of what is involved in testimony and participants' experience in the process. Thank you.
Maureen, thank you. And I go straight ahead now, Maureen?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you again for the invitation. It's great to be here. The first word that comes into my mind is the words are narrative hospitality. Narrative hospitality being that generosity of mind and spirit that enables us to listen with the ears of our heart to those narratives that lie outside our conditioning. Centuries no less, of division have rendered us here in this part of the world relative strangers to each other, antagonistic strangers even. We can seduce ourselves. You can seduce yourself with a mono-narrative, creating a one-dimensional world which can block our emotional, intellectual, and social flourishing. Narrative hospitality, flexibility, plurality requires an openness to acknowledge the many, the multiple. Words of the Northern Irish poet Louis MacNeice, writing in the troubled world of the mid-30s between two world wars, comes to mind just now from the poem Snow. World is crazier and more of it than we think, incorrigibly plural. An ethical commitment to narrative hospitality, plurality, and flexibility can enable us to resist and overcome the seduction of the single story. I welcome Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's TED Talk on the danger of the single story. In our divided communities, right here, authentic storytelling can serve as a bridge towards a more peaceful, inclusive community. These ethical narrative principles have underpinned our work towards understanding and healing, our testimony work over the past 20 years or so. And these principles clearly dovetail with other considerations. Our vision, our theory and practice must be beneficent, must reflect informed consent, must be restorative, as Maureen has spoken about, restorative of human dignity. Here in Northern Ireland, as we edge our way away from conflict, the troubles were more, as Maureen has said, more than 3,700 people have died, more than 40,000 have been injured, some of them savagely injured. So my intention here is to describe in some detail a number of testimony events coordinated by Towards Understanding and Healing. And while these have been publicly advertised, widely promoted and well attended, their genesis have been that private conversation that Maureen has referred to within the TUH committee. It was clearly articulated that if there could not, if there would not yet be justice, full accountability, then perhaps we could set in motion this testimony process where people would speak from their lived experience, people would share their personal truth. And these would not serve as an alternative to justice, but a complement to justice processes. Siobhan O'Neill, who's a professor of mental health sciences at Ulster University, and who's played a key role in the World Mental Health Survey Initiative, declared herself almost shocked that out of the 28 countries who participated in that survey, including Israel and Lebanon, Northern Ireland was the one whose population has the highest rate of PTSD. Northern Ireland is one of those populations which has the highest rate of PTSD. It was clear to us in TUH that we would need to provide significant trauma-informed support to each potential storyteller, each potential sharer of his or her testimony. It was also clear that these testimony sessions were not, I emphasize, not the place for folk who were too obviously burdened by their traumatic event. Of course, we're nervous about all of this. Would people be interested in publicly sharing their troubled story? Would they countenance being sat in a circle, opening up to relative strangers, attracted by a media publicity campaign? Clearly, the storytellers would need significant support before, during, and after. Would the prospective storytellers be okay with these events being publicly promoted through local radio, print, journalism? Would people come? Would people be interested? If they came, would they go with the envisioned ritualistic structure? Would there be folk who come along to sabotage? Would the audience who came, would they trust our ongoing commitment to inclusivity, to narrative hospitality, plurality, and flexibility? Would they in fact listen with the ears of their hearts? Could we together co-create a sacred space? Could the space created be accurately described as a sacred space? So we're taking risks. And very soon it became clear that we could attract volunteer storytellers. These courageous people were attracted after quiet, off-the-record conversations. They were people we knew or knew of through the years of solid and respected peace-building work developed by TUH. People who were willing to step out into that space, and I'm calling it a space of safe uncertainty, a safe enough space, hopefully one where they would receive acknowledgement and validation, a space where their risk-taking might be experienced as life-giving and life-enhancing. Over a period of weeks, TUH staff would listen privately with each volunteer storyteller. hearing in some detail their story, hearing in some detail their hopes about and fears about the process. We would visualize the event with them. We spoke about the public nature of the circle. We spoke about the fact that we did not know who would show up. We spoke about that risk, this safe uncertainty. And of course, and this is so important, we could not know what would happen emotionally once the storyteller had begun. But we reinforced our commitment to support each storyteller, whatever arose. We spoke with the storytellers about the witnesses. Let me tell you about the witnesses. TUH staff would nominate for each session two witnesses whose core job was to respond in an emotionally congruent way to the speaker and his or her story. So almost like a Rogerian approach, to respond in an emotionally congruent way to the speaker. These witnesses would role model the kind and quality of empathic response others in the circle might then go on to make. Witnesses would be agreed in advance with the storyteller. And if the storyteller said, no, I don't want that person, then we would seek an agreed alternative. We aim to invite witnesses whose relationship to the content of the storyteller's testimony added resonance and emotional depth. For example, when Alan Brecknell shared his testimony, the two witnesses agreed with Alan were a former loyalist paramilitary and a current member of the PSNI, formerly the RUC, that's the Northern Ireland Police Force. The resonance here arises from the fact that Alan understands that his father, Trevor, had been shot dead by members of a murder gang that included loyalist paramilitaries and RUC. Sometimes it was the wish of the storyteller to meet their witnesses before the testimony session. Sometimes it was the wish of the witnesses to meet with the storyteller. Sometimes the choice was not to meet at all, but to spontaneously go into the testimony session and let what unfolds there unfold. On a couple of occasions, only on a couple of occasions, the challenge to respond congruently and empathically to the storyteller, to the testimony sharer, proved to be too difficult for the agreed witnesses, who instead moved into telling their story. The testimony events were time limited, an hour and a half, including a half hour for lunch, and we would finish with a piece of music or a song. Given the time parameters, the space was also booked. The space in which the testimony would happen was booked for a further hour so that those who wished to chat on, could connect, perhaps over a cup of tea or coffee, made available from the Hollywell kitchen area. And some very important conversations took place in that unstructured space. I want to say a little about the ritual aspect of the session. There may be 40 or 50 chairs in the room. Before the session would start, I would place, or staff would place, crystals in the four corners of the room, north, south, east, and west. These crystals, rose quartz, aventurine, tiger's eye, blue agate, we become familiar with we become familiar with the use of crystals because we learned this from Maureen. This was done quietly and not particularly drawn to the attention of those who entered the room. As a facilitator of many of those sessions, I would then walk around outside of the circle of chairs, always in a clockwork direction, almost prayerfully, inviting a healing energy into the room. We were co-creating a liminal space in which healing and change had the possibility of happening. When people arrived, they broke bread together in a space humming with promise and positivity in this fabulous new building that myself and Maureen, work out of. And that brings me on to the very first testimony sharer by the name of Donald Dunn. This is to the core of this work. Donald Dunn's father, John, alongside a woman called Cecilia Byrne, They both were killed in a car bomb explosion on January 11, 1974. John is from a Catholic nationalist background, living in Craigan, a state which has become exclusively, I fear, Catholic nationalist and Republican. But he worked in a British Army military base across the river on the waterside. This base and the soldiers stationed there were the intended targets of the bomb that was secreted in Donald's father's car by the official IRA. Donald had never spoken publicly about his father's death. And while assured of our support, he was indeed nervous, naturally nervous. And yet he wanted to tell his story. He wanted to be heard. It's a subaltern story. Donald has too long been in the grip of a silence that did not serve him. Donald, his siblings, and his widowed mother had learned to say little in the days, the weeks, and the years after the bomb, as they were living in Craigan, as I've said, an area somewhat dominated by Republican paramilitaries who had killed both his father and Sissy Byrne. TUH provided Donald with emotional and psychological support before, during, and after his testimony. And we at Towards Understanding and Healing remained with Donald for the long haul. That afternoon, Donald's emotional testimony drew tears and further sharing from those gathered in the circle. One of the witnesses was and is an experienced counsellor and a former priest in the Craigan area, and he warmly acknowledged and validated Donald. Some others present in the circle had also experienced the dreadful loss of their father as a result of a bomb explosion and responded spontaneously to Donald's sharing with their own emotions. Harpist and fiddler Tracy McGorry, herself a peace builder, played poignantly, drawing that session to a close. Her music giving us all time to breathe, to take cognizance of what we had collectively experienced. Many folk then gathered around Donald, acknowledging his story and appreciating his courage. Afterwards, half a dozen of us joined Donald for a cup of coffee. That night, I checked in with Donald and his wife at his home. On the Friday, 2 days later, Maureen and I arranged a meeting with Donald. Donald's testimony was subsequently published in the TUH book, To Tell You the Truth. TUH also made arrangements for Donald to have sessions with respected somatic therapist Tom Dalton. We at TUH have begun to see more clearly that if trauma is lodged in the body, in the central nervous system, then more healing work was needed than testimony sessions could provide. Upholding our commitment to narrative plurality, hospitality, flexibility, our next storyteller was Irene Kerrigan. Irene is from the Protestant Unionist and Loyalist community. Irene's husband David was badly injured in an IRA bomb attack. In that attack, his sister Heather, who was 20, was killed, as was his friend and comrade Norman McKinley. This deadly explosion happened in the morning of July 14, 1984. Irene knew that coming to speak at Holywell, no matter how supportive we were, was certainly a risk. She correctly imagined that the majority in the room would be from the Catholic Nationalist Republican community. Once again, her testimony event enabled an acknowledgement and validation of herself and her story, and had one member of the circle from a Catholic Nationalist Republican background remarking how important it was to hear the other, how much that storytelling, that deep listening, humanized the other. David Kerrigan, Irene's husband, his sister Heather, and Norman McKinley were all members of the British Army. They were members of the Ulster Defence Regiment, and they were on patrol when ambushed by the IRA. The IRA perpetrated many such killings in the area they live. And the Protestant Union's loyalist community there feel particularly aggrieved that their suffering, their trauma has not been seen and not been heard. In ways, it's remarkable that Irene agreed to come and share her story with us. That relationship with TUH developed to the point where she supported TUH interviews with Robbie McKinley, whose brother had been killed, brother of Norman, and with her husband David. Both of these are published in To Tell You the Truth. Subsequently, Irene was keenly involved in community theatre processes, where her story and stories of other former UDR personnel and their families were converted into community theatre pieces performed by professional and semi-professional actors. These theatre pieces were subsequently filmed, and the DVD created is used by Towards Understanding and Healing in ethical and shared remembering, storytelling and dialogue sessions. I'm not sure how my time is doing there, Maureen.
You're okay.
I'm okay. So that I've spoken about Donal, spoken about Irene and Irene's family, and now I want to speak about Fiona Gallagher. Fiona Gallagher, brother Jim, was 20 when he was shot dead by a British soldier as he travelled homewards in a regular bus from the town centre. So he's travelling in a bus. Him and his girlfriend had just been to the movies. The soldier fired directly into the bus. The soldier said that he had cracked up. He'd lost the run of himself. One of the witnesses for Fiona Gallagher's testimony was the ex-British soldier, Lee Levis. Lee Levis' words to Fiona were warm, supportive, compassionate. It was a significant risk that Fiona took to agree to an ex-British soldier being a witness for her testimony. Ex-soldier Lee then agreed to share his own testimony. The Lee Levis testimony attracted over 100 people, sat in 2 concentric circles. The sheer number of people who attended underlines the interest there is within the Catholic Nationalist Republican community in hearing testimonies from members of the security forces. Just before Lee began, one woman from the audience, the late Frances McKinney, whose brother had been shot dead on Bloody Sunday, told Lee, "I'm not sure I'm going to like you." Lee was very keen to get her opinion afterwards. She responded, "I like you a wee bit." Fiona Gallagher and Lee Levis' relationship has developed to the point where they have come together a number of times to share their testimonies. For example, with Derry Peace Bites and with psychology students at Ulster University. Lee has also become a regular contributor to the human library process that's initiated here by Northwest Community Network. Fiona and Lee's positively evolving relationship is documented in the TUH publication, 200 Words and One Picture. Just last Friday, a Londonderry community relations worker complimented myself and Maureen on the work we've been doing. He asked, who else is doing this work? And of course, there are many others doing this kind of work. For example, the Commission for Victims and Survivors, Wave Trauma Centre, the Pat Finucane Centre, Healing Through Remembering, SEF. But that Londonderry community relations worker is more than aware of the many strands of the Protestant Unionist loyalist story that have yet to be told and yet to be heard. In committing ourselves to narrative hospitality, plurality, and flexibility, our vision remains one where we continue to open up safe enough spaces for all stories to be heard. Also, given the levels of trauma in Northern Ireland revealed by the World Mental Health Survey Initiative, it's clear that this testimony work must continue to be trauma-informed. When asked recently what surprises me about our peace process 24 years on, my answer is that I'm surprised we have not yet established a world-class trauma healing centre that draws on the expertise of the likes of Gabor Mate, that draws on the expertise of Peter Levine, Stephen Porges, Rachel Yehuda. I envisage such a centre as a starship positively influencing the quality and practice of the diverse storytelling and healing projects throughout this island. While I am confident that our testimony sessions, described in various levels of detail above, did serve to acknowledge and validate those courageous people, massively courageous people who took part, at the same time, I would acknowledge a need to develop our skills in the kindly light of the many advances in knowledge and practice in responding to trauma. Developing positive relationships remains central to the work towards understanding and healing. Our staff remain in contact with all those who took the risk to cross that threshold into that liminal healing testimony space. I'm reminded of a poem to finish off now, a poem by Seamus Heaney. The poem is called Keeping Going. It's a poem he wrote to Hugh Heaney. Sadly, Hugh died last year as well. In the final stanza of that poem, which at one point directly reflects the troubles and Hugh's experience of the troubles, he addresses his brother directly. So Seamus is saying to Hugh in this poem, Keeping Going, my dear brother, you have good stamina. You stay on where it happens. And Maureen and myself have good stamina, and we stay on where it happens. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to Anna, and any questions and answers.
Thank you, Maureen and Eamonn, for introducing us to Towards Understanding and Healing, for Eamonn for introducing us to narrative hospitality, and for sharing these amazing stories of testimony and healing. We have 2 questions in the Q&A box. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to add them now. Our first question comes from Gavin, who's asked, when mentioning a time to heal, a time for grief, was this a reference to Ecclesiastes 3:1-4? To everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance.
Well, no, not really, but we will certainly be taking that. Thank you so much. It's a beautiful quote.
Yeah, Ecclesiastes 3:1-4.
Yeah.
From Anne Gallagher, a friend and a colleague. What would you say has been the cumulative effect of your storytelling and dialogue work?
I suppose for us, when we did begin, it was actually in 1997, and it met with huge resistance at the time. And there's a lot of difficulties because of the politics of victimhood here, where people would look at their victims and they would have been single identity victim groups. So the cumulative effect has been our desire to widen the stories, and that involved not only residentials and workshops, but the training of trainers to enable us to have a much wider outreach. So we developed a training program, training DVD, and we were able to widen out the storytelling. The cumulative effect, I think, also is that so many more people have engaged in the processes and have found them very uplifting, and it has enabled people to move on. And as I said in my paper, they have become the agents of change and the hope for the future. And then because we live in a deeply segregated society, the opportunity to meet and talk with people and rehumanizing has certainly been evidenced in the amount of cross-community engagement and the wider encounters and their quests for same. Eamonn?
Yeah. You know, that's a challenging question from Anne Gallagher. You know, and unsurprisingly, it's a challenging question from Anne Gallagher. You know, my first thought was how individuals have gained from the processes they've been involved in, and hopefully then it's like we sometimes use the expression, the ripple effect, that those people perhaps influence somebody else who influences somebody else. My hope is when I mention people like Donal, that as a man coming with a burden of trauma, that he was able to find some healing. And that healing then, I left out some of what I wanted to say because he was also involved with us in a film documentary commissioned by the BBC Northern Ireland. And when that film was privately screened, his whole family came and they had this amazing conversation where they said things to each other that had never been said since John, their father John, had been killed. So little by little, stepping stones, ripples, I think we can be proud that we're doing good work. I am not sure of massive societal change, but I sense a respect that exists in our community in Northern Ireland and Ireland for the work of Maureen, and it's not egotistical for my own work. Yeah.
Thank you. Tamara Williams. Tamara writes, thank you for this extraordinary overview of the work you have done to bring healing. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how each of you came to do this work.
Well, for me, in the setting up of Towards Understanding and Healing, I was influenced by a number of inspirational people in the past, including Eamonn. So, there's a man called Damien Gorman, who was a poet and playwright, who set up an organisation called Anne Cran the Tree. And he was commissioned to try and see how we might hold a museum of all the lived experiences of people who had come through the Troubles in Northern Ireland, that somehow that those diverse stories or narratives would sit side by side in a holding repository or museum. So he was one such influence. Another was a Professor Dan Baron, who from the University of the Negev, and unfortunately is passed now, but he had brought descendants of Holocaust survivors alongside Nazi perpetrators. And he also were the descendants of Nazi perpetrators. And he was very influential in helping us to bring and encourage us to bring diverse voices together. Another guy called John Lindsay had access to ex-British soldiers. So all of those influences encouraged us to set up Towards Understanding and Healing, how we might actually get people to sit alongside each other. So there was a curiosity of people wanting to know the story of others and why they thought it was okay to do what they did, and the need to find out that. So in setting that up, it was a very, very, very sensitive process, as Eamonn has said time and again. And at the very beginning, we only allowed those who had done some work on themselves to come together to take that next stage. And it gradually grew. But in the end up, we became overwhelmed with people requesting through word of mouth, people requesting to come on such experiences because they too felt that there was some catharsis because many of them, for the first time, and Eamonn has alluded to this, for the very first time, being able to share their experiences and say to other people, this is what happened to me. This is what happened to my people, my community. This is what happened to my family. And then that getting the acknowledgement, recognition and validation, because there was never going to be a justice system for that person. But this is a way in some form of social justice to say, here's my pain. And the fact that they could be heard and respected, that they could open themselves to other possibilities and hear others as human beings and listen to their stories. So it was that, slow process. Ethics had to be a central consideration. And then, looking at how we actually view victims and the need to always work sensitively. And as Eamonn said, beneficence, do no harm. So that's just a wee bit.
Yeah, well, one of the things that comes to mind, Anna, is the very first Towards Understanding and Healing residential I was on was in the year 2000. And Dan Baron was in the room that Maureen has just mentioned, and he was facilitating a small group within a larger, there was a number of small groups, and we were on residential in an island called Lusty Beg in Fermanagh. And to my left, in this small group, a man turned out to be an ex-British soldier. And he actually was an ex-British soldier. As a soldier, had served in the Craigan estate where I come from, where I live. And I never before in my life, and at that point, what age? I was almost 50. I'd never had a conversation with a soldier, apart from a hostile one. Soldier stopping me and putting me up against a wall or whatever, putting a gun in my chest. And I heard things when he spoke that I'd never heard before. One of those was that his colleague had been shot dead in our estate. And he spoke about the violence he wreaked on the houses that he searched in the immediate aftermath of the killing of his friend. And it was like a light bulb, as they say, that's a terrible cliche, saying, I need to hear these stories. He become more human to me. And that night I couldn't sleep. And in the morning, it was the Sunday morning, I bumped into him in a corridor and I said, would you come to Craigan with me and bring me to where your friend was shot dead? And it turned out that his friend was shot dead in the street I grew up in. That's no word of a lie. He was shot and the gun had been fired from a house that I knew, not from within the house, an IRA shooter using the gable end to fire from. So that became a process of learning about the other, the humanization of the other. One of the things I remember about that man, that ex-soldier, was he was wearing, in the dead of winter, he was wearing shoes that would not keep his feet warm. And I had a sense of, this man's living, he's left the army, he's possibly drug taken, he's vulnerable, and he's impoverished. And I could see something different from the enemy that I'd previously boxed him in as. And that become a growth moment to become involved in this kind of work. And I've always been, my degree is in English literature and language. So I've always been interested in stories and how stories can move us. So that's...
I suppose very quickly, without going in, how did Eamonn and I end up working together? So we're still looking at that, aren't we? So
that's 30 years in February, Anna. 30 years in February.
I started working with Eamonn, and I had gone back to work, and my family would have been part of the security forces. My husband had just joined the police at that time. So to go back to work, I was very vulnerable at the time because my husband had been shot and seriously injured by the IRA and had lost his arm. So going back to work and working with Eamonn on a project in the community, and then having the courage and the capacity then for us, to Eamonn asked me what my story was as somebody from the Craigan area that would have demonized the police and army for their reasons. And for the first time, that was my first opportunity ever to tell out to anybody what had happened to me. And to also acknowledge that I was a victim in this too, not just my husband, because of the way that I had to live after that. And for Eamonn to receive that with open arms and caring, and for him to acknowledge that that's the first time I'd heard that type of story. They sort of think that wives of police have to be taken into account, children of police. And that was really a huge moment for me to be able to say that out. And that was thinking how healing that was for me, and then to move on to think this is something that other people should share. So.
I'm just thinking as well, the significant bit that you didn't say there was that you were pregnant.
Yeah.
So Maureen, in sharing that story with me in February 1992, was also pregnant when Dougie was shot. So that's a very significant detail. And I guess one of the things Damien Gorman talks about is the detail, and how the detail of the story is so important for the teller and for the listener. And it's that detail that draws on our empathy and draws on our compassion, draws on our heart. Yeah.
It's difficult if you've had something happen to you where people will nearly walk down the other side of the street rather than confront you because it's awkward, it's difficult, they don't know what to say. So you're left without having that opportunity or the catharsis of maybe putting your story out there. And particularly, if I talk to my own community, I reinforce the victimhood, but I'm more challenged when I'm speaking to people from the other community. And then to have the conversation around that, what it was like for me, and for Eamonn to express, his perspectives on all of that was really, really important. And that opened all sorts of doors. Again, light bulb moments where we thought this is something worth exploring more.
And that might be an example of narrative plurality, or narrative hospitality, plurality, flexibility, that I was able to hear, and that influenced me. That influenced me deeply. And it's, as someone from the Catholic National Republican community, it's of great interest to me, what is the experience of the other community, and how can I be in some kind of way healing in whatever I do, in whatever respectful way I do whatever I do towards that community. And it's a great privilege as well to hear what often people in my community have not heard. So they can then be seduced by that, the danger of the single story, seduced by that mono narrative. Yeah.
We have time probably for one more question from another friend and colleague, Amanda Feller. On the subject of stamina, have you ever had to take a step back, however briefly?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's times whenever it can become overwhelming. At one time, I remember soon after the Towards Understanding and Healing was up and running, there was so much pressure because, as Eamonn was saying, it's very, very sensitive, and top of our list is that do no harm. So how do we encourage people? So there's always that sensitivity, becoming overwhelmed when so many people wanted to undergo, explore and engage in the process. So I suppose at one point in time, it does become overwhelming, and Amanda's absolutely right. You have to take stock, you have to look after yourself. And I suppose for me at one stage, I was hearing so many stories, but it was like absorbing them like a sponge, but nobody was there to wring me out. They get, so they're just more and more and more and more, and just not looking after myself, and then realizing that you can take on a vicarious trauma or secondary trauma because you hold, the depth and the pain, and you lose. It doesn't matter the people's background, or you hear the story in the heart of the story, and so you end up carrying it, and it's held in your heart, and it's hard then to let it go. So absolutely, you have to take stock, look after yourself, and then go in again. And I'm very aware of the amazing work that Eamonn has been doing, the in-depth work, and particularly in the testimony process. So, yeah.
One of the things that we had funding, which I'm very grateful for, and I had supervision once a month with actually the man's called Jerry Cunningham. He's a professor of psychology, but he's also a practicing psychotherapist. So I could go to Jerry, and his frequent question was, so if you said, I met so-and-so and this is their story, his question would be, and what's the impact on you? How do you carry that story inside of you? What do you need to let go of? And I welcomed having that space. And of course, there are times when, I'm stressed to the hilt. And then there are other times when, I would go back to the word privilege. There's a tremendous privilege in what I have been able to do, and what Maureen has been able to do, and what we've been able to do together. Yes, and even going back to that banter in relation to Doogie before we started, that signals the kind of fun that there is in the relationship, and the intimacy even that in the relationship. But Doogie is a former policeman, so something has been transcended there, that we have got that contact, and that is that's the potential of all of this work, that possibility of connectedness. Yeah,
we see each other as human beings, and it's harder to demonize or to think differently whenever you've seen people, and that becomes a different story. We have to change the story we tell ourselves in relation to this. It's really important, and we have to walk in the other shoes.
Thank you. That's a wonderful way to end this. Again, my thanks to both of you. We miss seeing you. We hope to see you soon in person. And thank you to our audience members for joining us this morning. Our next session will begin at 11. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. And thank you, Anne and Amanda and Tamara and everybody who's been organising the symposium as well, and Rosemary and Travis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.